YouTube channel. However, we are only recording those of us who are unmuted and speaking. So as long as you stay muted, you will not be part of the recording. So don't worry about that. Please do use the chat box at any time throughout the evening to ask any questions that you have. We will save those up and David and I will pose them for you at the end of the night. So chat away in the chat box with any questions that you might have. Also, a huge thank you to all of you for being here tonight. And also for your continuing support of Northshire and of independent businesses. It's been a rough year. It's still a rough year. And the incredible support we've had from our customers and from all of you has made all the difference in the world. We're still here, we're still doing this, and that's thanks to all of you. So thank you very, very much. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to David to introduce our two wonderful guests tonight.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel. It is my great pleasure to get to introduce for a second time and to present to a Northshire audience for a third time, the beloved Ariel Lawhon, the critically acclaimed New York Times bestselling author of historical fiction. At Booktopia 2018, she presented the Northshire staff favorite, I Was Anastasia, and she joins us today to present her latest novel, codename Helene, now in paperback. And we are very lucky to be joined by Kim van Alkemade, the author of the international bestseller and Northshire staff favorite, Bachelor Girl. One of the silver linings of virtual events is us getting to know Kim, and it's a great pleasure, and many thanks for her joining us tonight. So everyone, please welcome to Northshire Live, Kim van Alkemade and Ariel Lawhon.
Thank you so much for this, and thank you for having me. I've told you before, I love Northshire. It's one of my favorite stores. I can't wait to come back again one day, hopefully soon. I'm really glad to be here.
And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. I so enjoyed reading this book. I can't tell you, I think I read it in 3 days. No matter how many words are in it, I read them all and just enjoyed it immensely. And it's really a pleasure to get to meet Ariel and to talk to her about her writing and her book.
Thank you very much.
So Ariel, why don't you start us off with a short reading from the book?
Yes, I would love that. So as you know, Codename Helene is the story of Nancy Wake. It is based on a true story. I would say 95% of the book truly did happen. It is the fictional telling, however, of her life and times during the war. Nancy was a young Australian expat who found herself in Europe in her early 20s, and she had just bluffed her way into a reporting job for Hearst newspapers. And one of her very first assignments was to go to Berlin and interview the newly appointed German Chancellor Adolf Hitler. And she saw the war break out and she was horrified. 8 years later, however, this is where I was captivated by her story. 8 years after interviewing Hitler, she killed a Nazi with her bare hands. And I wanted to know how a woman goes from being a young, naive journalist to quite literally killing the enemy with her bare hands. And this is her story of how she became that woman. She went from young expat to journalist to worker with the French resistance, and then spy with the British, and finally military leader. That was her evolution over the course of the war. And the very short passage I'm going to read for you tonight is actually Nancy's first attempt at clandestine activity, right when she becomes involved with the French resistance. So, it is only a few paragraphs long, if you will bear with me. The Hotel Martinez. It's only an envelope. That's what I tell myself repeatedly on the train. And there is nothing in this envelope but a set of fake identification cards, 4 in total, to be delivered to the front desk of the Hotel Martinez and picked up by a guest named Simon Bolivar. The only reason I know that this is not a real name of the person who will collect the envelope is because I have a very strange memory. I remember things, irrational things, odd little tidbits that stick in my brain and remain there forever. I think of it as a box of sorts that holds information at the ready should I ever need it. Sometimes it even empties itself of random objects and hurls them at me unbidden. The middle names of half a dozen famous authors, body limericks, dates, locations, facts, accents. Because of this, I know that Simon Bolivar is in fact not a real guest at the Hotel Martinez, but a 19th century military and political leader in Venezuela, responsible for freeing 6 South American states from colonized Spanish rule. Whoever collects this envelope will distribute the contents to 4 desperate people within the coming days. The identification cards will allow their owners to travel freely under assumed French names from Cannes to Marseille to Toulouse, where they will be collected by Antoine's friend, a woman he calls Francois, though I suspect that is not her real name, who will escort them to Perpignan and finally across the Pyrenees Mountains to whatever freedom they can find. The Marseille-Cannes train rattles along its track for 2 hours, and I sit in my seat, hair coiffed, belt neatly cinched, glad to be of use. I am wearing Victory red lipstick. There are false identification papers tucked inside my purse, and my heart is ticking fast enough to make me sweat.
And I think what you just shared is the first thing that really grabbed me when I started reading this book was the voice. And I'm so interested in how you were able to inhabit the voice in a way that made it your own, because this needs to be your story. You are telling the story. And yet you had some autobiographical material in which she wrote in her own voice. So I'm really curious about how you negotiated that and gave yourself permission to just own this voice, because it just feels authentic and real from the first page to the last.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm really glad to hear that, because I tend to think, at least for me and my writing process, voice is one of the harder things to accomplish. It does not always come as easy as it did in this case. I do think the fact that the story is told in first person helps, and the fact that it's told in present tense helps. Those 2 things give a very urgent sense of immediacy to the story, but I've actually got it here. I would say the thing that helped me most was Nancy's autobiography herself. It's called The White Mouse. It is long since out of print, but you'll see there all of my sticky notes that I have left. And as I read and write, I take notes and I underline and I highlight, which, by the way, is why I buy all of my research material, because librarians tend to frown upon you returning something that looks like this. I keep them forever once I have them. But in Nancy's autobiography, she tells the story of her life more chronologically than I've done in this novel. And immediately her voice comes through. She's got this really funny, smart, body way of looking at the world. And once I caught on to that, it became easier and easier to imitate as I went along. And there are plenty of places where I didn't have access to her thoughts on a particular event that happened, so I had to make them up. But after a while, keeping consistency was easy because she gave me the foundation for that and I built on it.
And you mentioned that in her autobiography is more chronological. And one of the things I really was interested in the way you structured this novel was the sort of shifting chronology that we start with Helene in 2 different points. Mm-hmm. And they get closer and closer as the novel goes by. And those are really challenging decisions for authors, where to start, when to go back and forth. And for me as a reader, it really worked because I was learning about what you said. How did she become an underground resistance spy parachuting into occupied France? And the story of she lands, she's in the parachute, she lands, and then we go from there. So those 2 things are happening at the same time. For me, it was really successful, but I'm so interested in your process. Did it appear all at once? Was it a struggle? How did you make those choices?
Great question. I did what I always do, which is start a novel chronologically, and then at some point sit there and go, it's okay. I'm not in love with it yet. This is just, I do this to myself every time. And every time I have to look at that and what I've written and go, okay, where am I going? What is my end point? What is, oftentimes it's either the last scene in the book, or as with my last novel, I was Anastasia, I was working toward the very last line in the book. To me, that was the most important line in the whole novel. And once I know what I'm working toward, then I can begin to go, okay, what is the best way to get there? And in this case, the novel takes place over 8 years. And there was a lot of sitting around and waiting in her life. There was a lot of just being in love or being happily married, or, as is common with clandestine work, there was a lot of waiting and doing nothing, which is really accurate to real life, but not at all interesting to read in a novel. So the switching timeframes allowed me to cut out all the parts where she was not doing anything, and it gave a sense of momentum to the story itself. It also allowed me to show Nancy in a state of always becoming. We began with her jumping out of an airplane into the forests of France. She's becoming a military leader. And in the next chapter, we flip back 8 years to her as a young journalist about to witness the Germans taking over Europe. She's about to become a resistance fighter. And we flip back and forth between those two things the whole time. And in doing that, you can see how a woman goes from being a journalist interviewing Hitler to a military leader killing the enemy with her bare hands. It was function for me, a functional way to tell the story, but it was also a way to keep things always happening. And she's always in the state of becoming a legend.
Yeah, so with the time jumps, like you said, it's such a great way to just jump over the waiting, or like, happy times, which as humans we enjoy, and as readers are, like you said, they're not so interesting. I appreciated that you always started the section like, where are we? When is it? I found that the writing was carrying me along so well that I wasn't really worried. I didn't have like a chart. I didn't feel like I needed to keep track in that way. Was that something that was important to you, or that your editor suggested, just to help your readers keep track of where and when? Since, like,
yeah, it's really important. And part of it is having learned over the years with my other novels, getting feedback or people saying, I was confused, I couldn't figure out where I was. I try to just make it really clear. We're in, 1939 in Marseille with these people. And if I give those markers at the very beginning, I feel like it just helps keep track, especially if you're doing what I'm doing, which is jumping around a lot. I think it's just a kindness to the reader to help them orient themselves every time they turn a page.
Yeah. I've had, in my first book, I really resisted that. I didn't want to have, I just was like, you can figure it out. And that people are always like, wait, what? Is this a different character? When is this? I was like, oh, I thought I gave you clues, but it is, like you said, it's a kindness. And yeah, and I wasn't trying, like I said, I wasn't making a map as I went, but I appreciated that I could always like take a quick look, wait, where are we? But I felt like, for me, the scene and the voice was so clear and present that I just went with it. And I never really felt very confused about where I was or what was happening, especially because from the parachute point in France, that storyline is just so propulsive. We are forming an army and engaging in clandestine activities and arming, resistance workers. And it was so propulsive.
Oh, I'm really glad. And I'm glad it worked, because I think one of our first jobs as authors is to gain the trust of the reader. We need them to hand over the willing suspension of disbelief, to go, okay, I'm in capable hands here. Let's see where you take me. Part of that is earned over the course of a career, over many, many books. But I think part of it is also established at the beginning of a novel, making the reader feel like, oh, okay, she knows what she's doing.
Mhm.
I'll go with her. And it's time and effort and revision and editing, and it's the thing that is built over the course of a novel being written, as you add in nuance, as you fix the parts that maybe aren't as propulsive. But I'm glad it worked. Thank you.
Oh, I enjoyed it very much. You sometimes shifted your point of view to Henri,
Mhm.
which was, I was really interested in asking you about that because it's not as consistent. It's every once in a while. And I wondered if that was a choice that was like a struggle for you, because it's, every once in a while we pop out of that point of view, that first person point of view. And were there scenes you just felt that the reader had to see, that you couldn't show them any other way? Or did you really want to give us like a little moment to sit with somebody else?
So yes, to all of those things.
Yeah.
It was a very specific choice on my part for a number of reasons. And actually, initially, my editor and agent both thought, we're not sure if we want him to stay. But I knew where the story goes, where the book ends, how everything unravels. I knew he had to stay there. So my technique for keeping him was I had him teach her 3 things throughout the course of the novel that come in, that are vital to her work with the French Resistance. He taught her how to curse in French, which sounds silly, but was very important. He taught her how to hold her liquor. He literally trained her how to drink so that she could really outdrink anyone that she was around. And he taught her how to ride a bicycle. And those 3 skills are vital when she's dropped back into the forests of France, leading all of those men in the French Resistance. And it's interesting that they are actually more consistent. We've got Helene at war, and then we've got Nancy at home. And every single one of Nancy at home chapters, there is this brief interstitial from her husband.
Oh, I didn't quite get that pattern.
Yeah. And for him, I just liked him. I thought he was fun, but I also thought it was helpful to occasionally see her from someone else's point of view, either to expose a flaw or to help her seem human. And I wanted that exposure to come from his eyes.
It was like I said, I was just really interested in asking you about that choice. In what I was reading, we talked about this a little bit. I had in your research. So this is a book. It's not just inspired by real events. It's not like my work tends to be situated in a real historical moment and informed by real historical events, but my characters are fictional, the things they do and say. And here you are working with a person who not only was a real character, she wrote in her own voice. The research that you do and the fidelity that you feel to all the facts, for me, I sometimes get a little overwhelmed, and it can sometimes be a struggle to reclaim that place you need as the writer. This needs to be the story you are telling. So how did you balance that in your writing process?
I never intended to write biographical fiction. I never set out to write about specific people or events. It just happened that way. My first novel was based on the real story of a missing judge. And then my second ended up being set on the last ill-fated flight of the Hindenburg. And then my third was about the Romanovs, all real people. I kind of stumbled into it. And for me, it's been fun. I only write about people that have since passed on. I would never, never, never dare to write about someone who is still alive. I struggle enough sometimes with the knowledge that these people may have descendants out there reading it. I always want to honor somebody's memory. But the best way that I keep that separation, I'm telling the story. It's very close to the truth, but it's my novel. And this surprises people sometimes, but I never interview anyone that knew the person. I will read biographies. I will read autobiographies. I try to find as much from their own point of view as I can, but I don't take the step to talk to somebody before. I've since talked to plenty of people after the books are published. But when I'm writing, it has to be my version of this story. And I can only do that if I don't have somebody else's memories and emotions and emotional attachment
Mhm.
in there. Otherwise, I'll worry. I will worry about offending people or disappointing people or getting something vital wrong. And the thing is, I'm going to get something vital wrong. That's part of the process. I will miss a date or a fact. I get occasionally hate mail from people that are angry that I messed something up. And I will always write back and I'll say, I'm so sorry. As you can imagine, in a book of this size and complexity, it's impossible to get everything right. But if I burden myself with that on the front end, then I become paralyzed and I don't work very well.
And we're not writing like academic histories, writing novels, and the reader comes to the novel with a different expectation and wanting a different experience. Someone could find Nancy Wake's autobiography, someone could read a history book about the French Resistance, but the novel is giving them this narrative experience full of adventure and characters and scenes and things that happen, and all like wrapped up in the voice that you've developed. And so it's a really different experience. And yeah, that feeling that, yeah, there's going to be facts that you get wrong. And then you have to remind yourself, but I'm writing fiction.
Right.
Did you come into fiction writing from a background of a lot of creative writing? Did you come into it as somebody who was interested in history? How did this happen to you?
Oh, great question, and an odd one, because I don't know that you'll have heard it before. I don't have any kind of academic history. I actually never went to college. It was not ever going to be in the cards in my particular life. I see several booktopians here, so I know that they have heard this story. Forgive me. I'll give the short version for those who haven't. But if you know where Taos, New Mexico is, it's 90 miles below the Colorado border. My parents moved there before I was born. They built a house with no running water, no electricity, and no television. And that is how I was raised. I spent the first 16 years of my life there with them. And I left home very early. I left home at 16. Actually, same as Nancy Wake. We have that in common. It's one of the few things we have in common. And I worked and I traveled and I taught myself to write because it was the only thing I ever wanted to do. As I said, I grew up in a house with no electricity, so we read a lot. And my mother read to us up into our teen years. And I knew from a really, really young age that telling stories was the thing that I wanted to do. So I pursued it pretty doggedly. And about the time I stopped having babies, my husband and I got married in 2001. Our first son was born in 2003, and we ended up having all four of them in 5 years. So I've been very productive for a long time. And as soon as we stopped having babies, I started writing books. But earlier you were talking about the difference between biography and fiction. When somebody picks up one of my novels, I assume they want me to tell them a story. They're not necessarily looking for a personal history of a historical figure. They're looking for a story, and telling stories is really the only thing I have ever wanted to do. And I'm just really grateful there is a profession that allows me to do it.
Well, I enjoyed the story very much. And I was reading that there's going to be a television series. How incredible, like, what can you tell us about, like, how does this happen and how do you feel about it? How connected are you to that process, or where is it? I mean, it's pretty cool.
It's surreal, to be honest with you. Oh, I was telling you guys earlier before we got started that the book came out in hardcover the week that everything shut down. Originally, it came out end of March of 2020. And originally I was going to be traveling for all of April and half of May on book tour. And that ended like overnight. And we had to pivot really quickly to online events. And what happened, ironically, instead of traveling around to bookstores for the month of April, I ended up being on Zoom calls with producers for the entire month of April. These were producers that were interested in the book. It had been submitted to them about the time the book published, and all of my books had been submitted as part of the publishing process. Typically, there's oftentimes either your literary agent will do it or a film agent who's working on the process. And I was used to it being submitted. I was not used to anything coming of it. And I spent a month talking to various producers who were interested in various different formats. Some of them wanted it to be a feature film. Some of them wanted it to be a television series. They all had ideas. One of them wanted to turn the whole thing into a comedy, which made me laugh because it's a funny book. I think it's very funny, but it is not a comedy. I mean, it's a war story. And eventually kind of settled down between two different producers and their visions for it. And I ended up going with a company called Anonymous Content. I'm sure you've heard of them. They've done True Detective. They did Mr. Robot. They did The Revenant. They've done a lot of critically acclaimed, amazing films and television shows. And at the moment, we're still in the early process. There is an actress attached. Her name is Elizabeth Debicki. She was just in Tenet. She's been in, oh gosh, she was in The Great Gatsby. She's going to be the next Princess Diana in The Crown. So she's phenomenal, and she's Australian, which is, I find perfect because she said that this would be the first role that she's ever done where she got to use her actual accent. And she was born in Paris, so she has all of these really fun attachments to the story itself. And I believe we're at the finding script writers and the mechanics behind how a show gets made, most of which I am not privy to. At one point, I was asked if I'd be interested in helping write the script, and maybe one day, perhaps one day when I no longer have children at home, I would have the bandwidth for that. But at the moment, I can't even wrap my head around trying to learn and master another craft on top of the one that I have. So I'm happy to leave that with the experts for now. And we'll see. I guess the next big thing, from what I understand, is whether or not it gets picked up by a studio for distribution or being made. I think it's kind of one of those things. One of the questions each of these producers asked me was how I felt about my story being turned into a show or a movie. And I kind of laughed. I was like, I don't know how to feel. Up until last week, this was one of those really cool things that happens to other people.
Yeah.
So I'm still holding it very lightly because I have no control. And the truth is, it's COVID. The world is strange. Everything's upside down, and there's no certainty that it will get made. I just think it's fun that someone wants to. And I think it's really fun that somebody else sees the vision for it and wants to translate it to a format that I actually know very little about.
Well, it's so interesting to hear you talk about like not having the bandwidth to learn a whole other craft, because it really, really is. I don't know myself anything about, screenwriting and playwriting, and it's so different than novel writing. And there are some authors who can do both, and that's pretty awesome. But it sounds like it's just this great like ride that you get to go on and see where it takes you.
Yeah. And I still have 4 kids at home, and currently 2 of them are homeschooled full time thanks to COVID. So my daily hours shrunk quite a bit this time last year, and it didn't seem fair to them to have even less of me than they do right now. But yeah, we'll see where it goes. I'm excited and hopeful and still just stunned.
Well, congratulations. It was, for me, it was a really cinematic read. Not that it felt like I was reading stage directions at all. The experience was very much immersive and novelistic, but the scenes were so vivid that in my mind, it's already a miniseries, which is, I think, the great thing about reading novels is that each reader gets to bring their own imagination. You have to engage. All we get is like words on a piece of paper. They're not very fascinating to look at. And you have to build that whole world in your mind, like in conjunction with the writer. And your book enabled me to do that in a way. Like I said, it feels like there was a mini series that happened already inside my brain. So I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. Let me just check in with Rachel and David and see if there are questions from the people who are here that they want to ask you. I don't want to monopolize all your time.
Sure, we could ask a few audience questions and then loop back to you, Kim, if we have some time.
Sure.
The first one we got was from Sharon Person, who is no relation and is the first not related person that I've ever encountered in the wild. So hi, Sharon. And she asked how long your research was.
How long the research process was? Trying to think. At least 6 months. It takes a while to grasp hold of a story, any story really. And what I've done with each of my novels, and I do this every time, and I don't know why it's surprising, but I surprise myself every time, is I pick a time period that I know nothing about, and I have to become this short time expert in it, which requires this deep dive into history. Thankfully, this time I only had 4 primary research books. My last book, I had about 50, and that was too much. Don't do that. But the 4 books that I used primarily for research were Nancy Wake's autobiography, The White Mouse, Nancy Wake by Russell Braddon, the SOE's Greatest Heroine. Again, more sticky notes. The Women Who Spied for Britain by Robin Walker has a really great chapter on Nancy. There's only 1 chapter about her, but it's a very succinct synopsis of her life. And that was helpful because it was small and it was short. And then Peter Fitzsimmons had a biography of Nancy Wake. This one was published in Australia. Very helpful. This one was more Nancy's relation to the war versus Nancy's life. So each of these books sort of brought her to life in a different way. And I read them all and then I pieced them together. But I used Nancy's autobiography as my primary resource. And it was fascinating, actually, because in her book, she talks about jumping out of that airplane and parachuting into the forests of France on February 29th, Leap Day, right? That's a really easy day to verify. Her biographers have completely different dates, and it would make me insane. It's kind of, if you have a brain like I do, where you want to get the story straight, it will make you halfway crazy to read varying accounts. So I always stuck with Nancy's account because it was her life. I assume she actually knew what happened in it. But it was also fascinating to me to read a male spin on her life. One of her biographers in particular hints at moral behavior that she never did. And I was always fascinated to know if he was exaggerating or where he came up with some of this stuff, because she was really blunt about what she did and who she was and where she went, and was not ashamed of a single moment of her life. So I can't imagine her leaving some of those more salacious details out of her own memoir. But there were different accounts and I always picked hers. So yeah, about 6 months. And then I kept them on hand always. If I was writing about a battle, I could flip open each different, there are different sticky notes to show which was what part of the book, what code name. And I'd flip it open and I'd go back and I'd find a detail and clarify. And I researched the whole time, but up front, a good 6 months.
That actually ties in. There was a question from Mary, which you mostly answered, about what other resources you use, but she asked also, are there many articles and stories about Wake that were written during her lifetime?
In her later years, yes, you can Google any number of different articles. When she passed away in 2011, there were a number of obituaries written about her. The best thing, though, I don't recommend doing this if you haven't finished the novel, but if you have finished, pour yourself a very large glass of whatever your favorite beverage is. Nancy would say brandy. Go to YouTube and search videos of her. It's phenomenal. There are any number of documentaries and just interviews that she did in her later years. And she never lost a bit of vim or vigor. And she's hilarious. There was a movie made about her life in Australia, I think in the early 80s. And in this interview, somebody was asking her about it. And she's like, it was terrible. They have me out in that forest cooking bacon and eggs for all those men. And she's like, first, there wasn't bacon or eggs to be found for love or money. And second, I had men to do that for me. And you have to love her. You have to love her because she just spoke her mind. And I appreciate anyone who speaks their mind.
Thank you so much. That's really, really fun. We've got a question here from Anne O'Brien Corelli, and she says, the book seems to have underlying themes and messages that may not be so apparent. Can you talk about those?
Yes. Oh, there are several, actually. The two that come to mind, and this is a comment that I get quite a lot, is the story of a good marriage. You have Nancy, you have her husband, they fall in love, and they have this really wonderful, really lovely marriage. And I call it a pet peeve of mine. That might be too strong. I wish there were more good marriages portrayed in print. I understand why there's not. It's hard to write about a loving marriage. There's no conflict, and conflict is the heart of story. So it makes absolute sense why there are all these horrible, murderous marriages in print. But I want to see more good ones. I just celebrated my 20th anniversary. So I have a soft spot for a happy marriage. And I wanted to portray a happy, committed marriage. I wanted to portray a good love story. I wanted to portray a good man. I happen to be married to one. I'm fond of them in general. I wanted to put one in print. And I wanted to see if I could tell that story and still maintain tension and conflict throughout. Let's see, another theme, I suppose, that seems to come to light a lot or that people are curious about. There's a story early on in the novel where Nancy bluffs her way into this reporting job, and it comes out that she's not getting credit for the stories that she writes. There's no byline with her name. And that was true. I spent a good 6 weeks or longer looking for the articles that she wrote for Hearst newspapers. Couldn't find them. They're gone. None of her biographers cite them. She doesn't have them in her own book. I wanted originally to use little excerpts of them. They're gone. And what I found out after a very lengthy search is that Hearst doesn't make their archives available online, so you can't find them. And at the time, it was common practice, not universal practice, but common practice for women to not get a byline when they wrote for newspapers. The stories would either be filed under their supervisor's name or no name at all. And as I worked on this, it became really apparent to me that Nancy was being erased from history, even as she was writing it. And I think a lot of women, particularly in this day and age, really respond to the idea of getting credit for your work, having your name on something, getting the credit for it, and having that last through history.
That's really important and a great point. Thank you. There's a question from Tom. He asks, are the paragraphs that you read at the beginning the opening paragraphs of the book? It sounded like you were launching in somewhere a little ways into the story.
Yes, they're not the opening paragraphs of the book. They come, let's see, roughly halfway through. It is in the version of Nancy before she goes to war. The opening of the book is actually Nancy on a Liberator bomber taking off from an airstrip in London and being flown over the English Channel toward France. And the chapter ends with her jumping out of an airplane for the first time into a war zone. So I wanted to open with a bang. And I mean, you couldn't pay me to jump out of an airplane, but she did.
And then a great quick question from Nancy. She says, it sounds like you have quite a story in your own life. Have you ever thought of writing a memoir?
That is actually something that I get asked whenever I give a little bit of information about my background. I doubt I ever will. I don't know that all stories need to be told necessarily. I think that memoir is an art form in and of itself. I don't know. I certainly wouldn't do it anytime now. I certainly wouldn't do it when my father since passed on, but my mother's still here. And I think I would never want to hurt her. I wouldn't ever want to expose parts of her life necessarily that she hasn't talked about. And memoir is not just about the person writing it. It's always about the people in their lives. And I don't know, maybe one day, but probably not.
Thanks, Ariel. There's a comment here from DK Cost that I thought I'd share with y'all, then maybe we can go back to some questions from Kim. DK Cost says, I thought the book was brilliantly written and want to do additional research. I was struck by her glamour and her grit, her red lipstick, and her profound profanity.
So she wants to do more research. Is that the question?
Well, it was just a comment.
Oh, it's a comment.
She
Okay,
wants
sorry.
to do more, DK Cost wants to do more research about Nancy.
Yes, then I would highly recommend trying to find them. Most of these are out of print. Peter Fitzsimmons, Robin Walker, Russell Braddon. I know this one has been reissued. I think this is nearly impossible to find anywhere. I think I bought this from a used bookstore in London and it took about 8 weeks to get here. Google her, YouTube her. She's so much fun. Buy some red lipstick. Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
I really relate to you looking for those sort of primary resources and wanting to own your own copy of it. I end up getting a lot of books from, like you said, used booksellers who, a lot of them will list things online now, so you can order things. And if a book is a little bit too off topic or really expensive, I've gotten in the habit of, because I'm affiliated with the university, I'll just say, can you get that from Interlibrary Loan? And they will track it down almost always. But that sense that you have that book, that you can highlight it, that you can make it your own, you can put your notes in it. It sounds like that's a really, almost like a tactile part of your process.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It turns out I don't like reading electronically. I just don't like it. I don't enjoy it. I almost never do. I like having the paper. I still smell books. I know that's probably weird, but I do. I keep all of my favorite books on my bookshelf. This wall of my office is bookshelves as well. I almost never reread, but I will hug them sometimes. I like to pick up a book and just kind of think back to the way it made me feel when I finished. And I do that with research material as well. I don't ever get rid of it once I'm done with a novel. When I finish a novel, I get a box and I put all of the printed versions that it has been, the past pages, the copy edits, the advanced release copy, the hardcover, when the paperback comes out, if it sells anywhere else. And then the last thing I put in there before I tape it up and box it away is all of my research material. And I keep them all together as a little family. I don't imagine my kids will ever care about it, but I like that I can find my entire process for that book in one box anytime I need it.
Yeah, I really relate to that. I have like the shelf that was like my first book, and being able to see those books. Yeah, it's, I don't know, it triggers everything in my mind, being able to see the spine or pick up the book. It like reminds me of so much. I'm really interested. Do you have any sort of personal rules for fact versus fiction? Is there a story that you tell yourself, like, when is it okay to speculate? When is it okay? You're like, I don't know if this really happened or stuff, but it has to be in the story. Or then on the other hand, you know, you were talking about like these tiny details. Did they have this at this time in this place?
Mm-hmm.
You want to verify them. So I'm always interested with historical fiction writers, if you have a sense of that for yourself, like if you have a little rule book that you tell yourself.
Yes, it's not printed, but I've always told myself that if it can be verified by history, I can't change it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm writing about real events, real people. For instance, my novel, Flight of Dreams, was set on board the Hindenburg during its last ill-fated flight, and it took place over 3.5 days, and every single person in that novel was real. They all existed. They were all on that ship. If they died in real life, they had to die in the book. If they lived in real life, they got to live in the book. That's the only one I've written where everybody was real. Sometimes I have made people up. Occasionally I'll make a composite. In I Was Anastasia, there's 2 men that are composites of all of the various horrible military leaders that the Romanovs ran up against. In this book, there's only one person that I made up. His name is Louis, and I love him. He just makes me happy. So typically I stick as close to history as I can, and I find my story within the cracks. I build a story within the things we cannot verify for sure, and this has always been my rule, and I thought I would never deviate from it. But the novel that I'm working on now, I find myself deviating for the first time. So instead of based on the life, it will be more of an inspired by the life.
Inspired by. I love the inspired by,
Yeah.
Which is sort of a little entry, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now or where you're going next?
Yes. My computer is sitting on the book, on my main research book, or I would show it to you. Sorry, the book is like this thick. Another out of print thing I had to find on the website of a bookstore in Maine, actually. My next novel is tentatively called The Frozen River, and it is inspired by the life of a woman named Martha Ballard. She was a midwife in the late 1700s in Maine, and there are a number of fascinating things about her story, not the least of which is that she delivered over 1,000 babies during her 30-year career, and she never lost a mother. And I find that astonishing because modern OBs can't brag statistics like that. That's how good she was. There were any number of miscarriages and stillbirths as happened, and as happens in childbirth, but she never lost a mother. And I thought it was such a phenomenal record. She is the aunt of Clara Barton. She is the grandmother of one of the first female physicians in the United States. So her legacy in the world of medicine is astonishing. But the reason I decided to write about her is because she kept a diary for 30 years. And she did so at a time when many women couldn't read or write. But in this diary is recorded everything that happened in her small village, every birth, every death, every murder, every scandal, every plague. But also in its pages is the only written record of a rape trial that changed the legal system in our country. So it's fascinating to jump that far back. I have primarily written in early 20th century. There's definitely been cars and electricity in all of my novels so far, but I get to jump even farther back and build a world without any modern convenience. It's been fun and challenging at the same time.
And so with this diary, what about it then shifts it from based on to inspired by for you? Did you feel like there's just not enough, or you felt a little more free if you could create a character just a bit adjacent to that historical person?
So part of it is her diary. It's more of a day book than a diary. She does not editorialize at all. She says, this happened and that happened. It was sunny. It was snowy. Actually, in half of her entries, she ends them by saying, I have been at home. And I thought, how apropos is that I am writing this book in the year that I have been at home. Mm-hmm. I could write my own diary entries every day and that would be it. I have been at home. So it's dry information. She very rarely gives her feelings on anything. So I thought this would be fun. I know these events happened. I know these people existed. I have almost no information for the first time. She would be completely lost to history if not for her own diary that was preserved and passed down and finally donated to a museum in Augusta, Maine. And then some blessed soul came along and typed the whole thing up. And there was a very limited printing in 1992, I think, of just a couple hundred copies. And I managed to get my hands on one of them.
How you stumble across this or know to look for this?
Again, the way it always happens to me, I randomly read an article about her and it mentioned how many children she delivered. It mentioned the fact that she'd never lost a mother. And I thought, that is fascinating. And I love midwives. My mother had 6 children and she had all of them at home with midwives. So I just have a fondness for them. I've seen many a midwife at work. And I thought, I want to write about one. And I don't know, found her story, did a little more research, and thought, I think I can do this. And I've actually been holding on to that idea for 13 years. I found this idea before my first novel, actually. And I thought, I'm not ready. And then suddenly I feel ready. So Martha gets to be the next book.
Oh, I can't wait to meet her.
I'm glad. Thank you.
It sounds so great. And that sense that you hold a story until you're ready, and it sounds like maybe some of that historical basis. So I'll ask you if that gave you a bit of courage to start writing historical fiction, and now you feel like you can just take up something that's going to require a little more imagination from you. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think. All of my novels so far, the story has been there. I've known the main points, and my job was to go in and bring it to life or structure it in a way that made the story fresh and new. This will be the first time that the bulk of the story and the plot and the events comes from my imagination instead of the historical record.
That sounds exciting.
It
Are you
is
excited?
Terrifying too. I'm excited and terrified at the same time.
That sounds about right. That sounds like what writing feels like.
Well, and I don't know if it works this way for you, but I have to pick the idea that scares me most. I always have a list of ideas that I could write that I think would make great novels. But when it comes time to commit to one, I always look at that list and I try to identify the one that scares me senseless. Because if I am afraid, if I have that uncertainty, if I feel like this might be the time I fail, it forces me to bring my best work to the table. It forces me to push outside of my comfort zone, and it makes me try harder than I ever have. And I personally need that. I need to know that I'm telling a story I've never told before, that I'm telling the one that brings me right to the edge, sort of, this could be great or the worst book ever written. I need it to maybe be one of them.
Yeah, it's actually a really helpful thing for me to hear tonight. I'm just finishing up a section of the book I'm working on, and I similar to you, I tend to go back and forth into kind of chronologies. And for the first time, I've gone out of New York. I tend to be very like early 20th century New York is like my little wheelhouse. And but my father was born in Rotterdam and was a child during the Blitzkrieg on Rotterdam. And so I'm writing a whole section of chapters set in the Netherlands during the occupation in World War II. And yeah, very afraid of making a mistake, very conscious of that, even though I have such a strong connection to the culture and to the time, still very worried about, getting things wrong. And yet feeling like the little story I'm focused on it's so important to me now.
Yeah.
And it's like, it needs me to finish telling it, even though it's hard and worrisome. So
I think it matters. The story has to matter to you deeply. There comes a point where you have to care, because this is, for me, it's several years of my life from idea to published book. I have to care a lot, and I have to be afraid. I have to, I don't know. I have to really wonder if this will be the time that I won't be able to pull it off, because it forces me to work harder.
Well, that'll be what I bring to my desk tomorrow morning. I'll be like, embrace the fear.
Yes. Fear is good.
Cool. What a pleasure it's been to talk to you. Let me check in with David and Rachel and see if anything else has come up from the comments that we want to make sure that we get in before the time is over.
Thanks so much, Kim. I think we just have one question left, and I think we almost got to it for a minute there. And that, let me see if I can find it here.
It was
that
Bill,
from Bill. There.
asking us about asking about the notes behind you, Ariel, and what those are.
Oh, that is a book in process. It's, I don't know, it's here on this, above this desk, and then it's all the way across that wall. There are notes and ideas and details. I wish you could see that one. That one, I've been joking, looks very much sort of Russell Crowe circa A Beautiful Mind. There's pictures and tape and red string connecting things. You'd mentioned earlier that I seem to be very tactile, and I'd never really thought of it that way, but I suppose that I am. I need, when I'm building a story, I need to see the various pieces and parts. I need it. I've got a picture of a fox there and a picture of a falcon, and I need the reminder, the visual reminder. I sit in my office most of the day, and there's something about being surrounded by my notes, my ideas, little plot points, pictures that makes the story hover. It just stays closer to me than having a box or a binder that I put away at the end of the day. So if I can see it the entire writing process, it's easier for me to tap into the next morning when I start to write.
It's so funny you say that. I'm looking across my computer at my wall of the book I'm writing, and it's very similar pictures and headings, and it's kind of, as the book is being written, it's filling in more and more. And yeah, I really relate to that, to be able to come in and look and not feel like everything's a digital file or tucked away somewhere, that it's surrounding you.
I don't know. I like having it in person, and it will devolve from here. It's going to get so bad. It will get to a point where my husband and kids don't even want to come in. There will be dust and piles everywhere, and it will stay that way until I finish the novel. And you can always kind of tell where I am in the writing process based on the condition of my office.
What a joy it's been to talk to you, Ariel, and get to know you and talk about writing and to be part of this. Thank you so much for, I don't know, for letting me be part of it tonight.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. This is the part of the process I really love. I'm an extrovert, so it kind of balances out all of those months and months where I just sit by myself and cry and try to get the story right. And thank you, Northshire, as well. I love you guys. I love the work you do. Someday soon we'll be doing this in person again. Hi, Linda, my Booktopia friend. Good to see you.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Thank you so much, Kim. This has been just a delight this evening.
Thank you very much. I've loved it.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. And we'll see you at another Northshire Live coming up soon. Take care and have a wonderful night.
Have a good evening.
Everybody.
Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful.
Thank you.